Hello, it's Monday, June 10th. This is Robert Moynihan of Inside the Vatican magazine, and I have the pleasure of introducing Damian Thompson from London, England, a Catholic journalist. Damian, thanks for having you.
It's a pleasure.
Damian, you're a combative journalist, but you're very well informed, and I'm interested to have this conversation with you because our church and the world in general is filled with problems. And you have a lot of information that can help us come to conclusions on what we ought to do.
Well, Bob, it's an honor because if anybody's well informed, it's you. I've been reading Inside the Vatican for many, many years. What have you been going for 20 years?
30.
30 years. So I've been reading it for probably most of that time. And it is extremely well informed, and at a time when the Vatican press corps it may be well informed, but it's certainly not telling the truth about
Now,
what's
there you go. So let's begin with that. What truth does it tell, and what lies is it telling?
the biggest scandal or group of scandals in the church today, simply by virtue of who's involved and the implications, involve Pope Francis.
Okay.
This is a man who has demonstrably covered up a series of scandals involving his allies. They either back in Argentina or Argentinians. He's moved to Rome or other sleazy people. And over the course of the last few years, he has attempted to interfere with the Argentinian courts to stop the child molester Julia Grassi going to jail. He created a very dubious figure called Gustavo Zanchetta. He made him a bishop, and when that exploded amid allegations of financial wrongdoing and predatory homosexual, approaches to seminarians, many of them, what did Francis do? He airlifted him into the Vatican and gave him a job as assessor of the Vatican Treasury. And now we have the unspeakable Rupnik scandal, in which a former Jesuit priest, creator of these revolting sinister mosaics that are plastered all over churches all over the world, despite being very credibly accused of rape and grotesque sexual assaults against women religious, by women religious, who, by the way, none of whom have been given the opportunity to speak personally to the Pope, is being protected to the point where he is still, as we speak, a priest in good standing in Slovenia, having been transferred back to a diocese there, clearly with the permission of the Pope. So that's a horrible situation. And what's equally horrible, really, is the complicity of so many Vatican journalists.
Okay.
Keeping the story off the front pages.
Damian, we have Alison Cassidy watching from Scotland. And she says, glad to see you with Damian Thompson, Bob. Always watch your wonderful podcasts. Thank you.
I must do more of them because it's just up to me whether I do them or not. And I get discouraged sometimes. So that's nice to hear.
Okay.
Yeah, you say, here we are. Antonio's saying his artwork is all over the place. Lots of Marian sanctuaries, Fatima, San Giovanni Rotondo, and of course the National Shrine in Washington, D.C. and the Knights of Columbus are dragging their feet over this. They need to just tear the stuff down.
Okay, so just to make clear to people, you've given us 3 examples, and I believe there are more.
There are.
Where Pope Francis has dragged his feet or hesitated or actually done the opposite of investigating and punishing sexual abuse. He's apparently covering it up. The first case was Grassi. The second case was Zanchetta. In Italian, with the CH is pronounced K.
Yeah.
You said
Zanchetta, but I guess it's actually Zanchetta, I suppose. Who cares?
Maybe. Okay, so he's Argentine and accused of molesting his own seminarians. And he's now got a high office in the Vatican. And then Father Marco Rupnik, whom I know personally.
Oh, do you? Right.
Yes. He had a center called the Centro Aletti. He still has it in Rome, not far from St. Mary Major Basilica, where 10, 20, 30 Eastern European art students, mosaic students, often from Orthodox backgrounds, sometimes from Russia, Ukraine, but also the Eastern European countries, Poland, Slovakia, would come and have a 4-week or 8-week or even a whole semester trained in the Centro Aleti. And in this center, he's been living for almost 30 years. And he was hired by Pope John Paul II to create the mosaics for the papal chapel in the Vatican called Redemptoris Mater, the Mother of the Redeemer. That's the chapel Pope John Paul II prayed every daily morning mass, usually about 7 in the morning, and I went to some of his masses there.
Yeah.
With my late departed father. And those mosaics and the allegations against Rupnik have been believed. The Jesuit order removed him from the Jesuit order.
Yeah.
But Pope Francis last year said that he would proceed forward to investigate and somehow come to a conclusion, but no trial has ever been held. And
well, he only said that because the news that Rupnik was being returned to a diocese in Slovenia was being incarnated in a diocese in Slovenia leaked. And all the usual suspects, the National Catholic Reporter, America Magazine, the dreadful guy who does the Catholic Herald, which is very painful for me because I used to be editor-in-chief of it.
You were the editor-in-chief of the Catholic Herald.
None of them. I remember I was in Rome. I remember walking up and down the Corso Vittorio Emanuele, or whatever it's called, checking Twitter, X, thinking that it's now been confirmed by, it was, I think, Luke Coppen of The Pillar was the first person to put it out in English. They've got, and confirmed, they've got to react to this. They've got to react to this. And none of them said a thing. They didn't say a word. They sat on the story until finally Francis was forced to say, okay, I'll lift the statute of limitations. I hadn't realized, or some such rubbish.
Because
John Allen comes forward and says, oh, this is the Pope's October surprise, at which point I'm like,
so you're
forced to say he would do something about it, but he hasn't.
So you're criticizing the way the Pope has handled his office, maybe not himself, but the people who should be handling these things for him. There's a lack of attention, or far worse than that, there's a positive support for people who are accused of serious abuse that in this pontificate is creating a pattern that's of deep concern to you. This is the same type of thing Archbishop Vigano has said, but you don't like Archbishop Vigano.
I don't like Archbishop Vigano at all because he dabbles in conspiracy theories. He makes unfounded claims. For example, he came out the other day and said that the Pope, somebody had told him that the Pope had molested seminarians or whatever, or Jesuit novices. He provided no evidence beyond saying that somebody had told him that. Now, certainly in English, British libel law, you could, the Pope, if the Pope wanted to, could sue him for that, because you don't put out an allegation without backing evidence. And I thought it was very interesting that lots of traditionalists who were as hostile to Francis as I am, which is saying something, immediately said you should have kept, you had no business putting that out there without supporting evidence. And it deeply undermines the credibility of his earlier claims. Now, I think his original claim was completely true, but I think he then went nuts, and he was encouraged to go nuts by people on the Catholic fringe who got their hooks into him. I don't mean you, Bob, but other publications got their hooks into him, and that annoyed me. Now he's just useless. It's complete. Vigano's support testimony, whatever, is you really want to keep him well away.
Okay, we have someone from Brazil watching. So, Damian, we have people in the United States.
You can trust and love Vigano. That's fine. I don't.
All right.
And I've been a journalist. I've been a journalist covering religious affairs for 35 years or whatever, and I believe that Vigano told the Pope what he said he did. But then within a year or two, Vigano was getting involved in all sorts of other controversies that divided and distracted people from what should have been a laser-like attention on what the Pope knew and when. And we're in a situation now, 5 years later, or whatever it is, where the Pope is still able to evade questions of what he knew and when by saying, oh, the people accusing me are conspiracy theorists. And enough of them are that the sort of Team Francis people can work with that. And I find that very frustrating.
Okay, so you're giving a really double-barreled attack on how this morality of the Holy Father and of the papacy has been diminished in the eyes of the world, both by the actions of covering up certain things and by the attacks of others who have wandered into what you're calling conspiracy theory. So you're
That's not what I'm calling. They are conspiracy theories. I've written a book about conspiracy theories. My doctorate was in, was to do with conspiracy theories. I know one when I see, but that's not my doctorate, by the way.
Okay,
but
actually, we should call you Dr. Damian Thompson.
I didn't use it, but the point is, my doctorate is published by Oxford University Press, and it's called.
Okay, so you're an Oxford.
Waiting for Antichrist.
You're an Oxford PhD.
No, I'm not. No, I'm a Londoner. I have.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm an Oxford undergraduate, and my PhD is from the London School of Economics.
Okay, so the double-barreled attack. If someone who's a journalist and wants to tell the truth, and because the truth will set you free, as you might recall Jesus once said, the truth shall set you free. But we're covering up on the one hand, seems to be covering up pretty evidently. And only after great efforts do finally people try to say, we're going to reveal, we'll do a report, we'll have a trial. But on the other hand, the people criticizing are also seemingly going off their rocker, as you at least in your view. Is there a third way? Is there a third way that we could create a kind of team of honest journalists and honest people who could try to do something to restore the church?
On this subject, I'm not going off my rocker. I could be accused of going off my rocker, and am frequently on all sorts of things. But on this subject, I'm not. You're not, Bob. There are lots of people who, I'm having a sort of fight with the Pillar publication because they seem to be slightly instrumental in tightening the restrictions on the Latin Mass, whether they intended to or not. I really disliked the way that they handled that whole controversy. But they're not conspiracy theorists, and they're bound by their intense loyalty to the Holy See. So you notice that as soon as something implicates Pope Francis, being a Catholic publication, being a publication that needs to keep on reasonably good terms with the US Conference of Bishops and things like that, they tend to back off, or at least you have to read between the lines with Pillar reports. But it's not that hard. Ed Collin is a very good reporter. It's not that hard to read between the lines when he's saying, well, one might ask what the Holy Father might reasonably have. You just have to read between the lines. Interesting that you call him the Holy Father. I never do, ever, ever, ever. He's the Pope. I'm not a sedevacantist. I think that's a preposterous position. But I remember talking to a very, very well-known Catholic whose identity I'm not going to reveal, but hugely admired, globally admired. And I said, I don't call him the Holy Father. And this person said to me, no, I haven't called him that for years. Because it's an honorific title, and he's not holy, and he's not a father. He has this position which has, tremendous religious significance. But he's a bad Pope. And so I'm not going to, I'll call him Pope Francis, but I won't go any further than that.
Well, Damian, we're going to come.
Bad man.
Okay, we're going to come back around this question to try by the end of our conversation to offer some hope to people. But you and I have both been raised in the Catholic faith. It's in a time now where there's a great crisis, a lot of confusion. Millions of people have stopped practicing. They don't baptize their children any longer. So something has, and this is revealed also in the Anglican Church, which used to have millions and millions of practicing Anglicans, now down to just 1 or 2 million, I believe, in the whole country of England, who would attend Sunday
Not
So
even that. Not even that. It's about half. It's what? Between 300,000, maybe 500,000 on a Sunday. I remember the numbers being when I was a religious affairs correspondent of the Telegraph back in the early 90s. The number was hovering around the million mark, and they knew it was going to drop below that. It's a bit like circulation of the Daily Telegraph, which I worked. It was always proud of having a circulation of a million. It was terrified of dropping below that. Well, they both have, and now dropped way below that. I won't talk about the Telegraph.
okay, so this,
the Anglican Church is down to a few 100,000. So is the Catholic Church in England and Wales, which used to be almost the same number of Sunday worshippers, which was impressive. And if now it's, I suppose, as a proportion of members of the church who practice, it's higher than Anglicans, but it's boosted by immigrants. If you took recent immigrants away, I don't know what the figures would be, but look, there's a decline in church attendance throughout the Western world. Protestant, Catholic, doesn't make much difference.
And so the point of this is to say we're a world that was influenced profoundly by Christian beliefs and a belief of being merciful and being supportive of families, etc., has become a post-Christian world, and all sorts of strange phenomena are being released. And we could become a very cruel world, as the wars right now occurring show. If you start bombing cities as we did in World War II, which was a terrible war, and now 500,000 or more Ukrainians are dead. I don't know how many.
I really don't see what Ukraine's got to do with this.
No, I'm just saying the world could become a world without any concept of human sacrality, the sacredness of human beings.
Well, hang on. Let me stop you for a second there. The argument about what military action to take in Ukraine, and there's always, at any point in history, there's always a controversy over that. This is one of those topics that divides Catholics pointlessly. Really does divide Catholics. I mean, I know there's one very ostentatiously pious Catholic I know at the moment who is making life hell for a Ukrainian Greek Rite Catholic priest, a very nice and holy man, because this guy basically admires Putin, and it's just, and the whole thing is just, I'm like, why did you need to drag this in? Catholics can legitimately disagree about what the right response to, I think, Putin's abominable invasion of Ukraine was. It's something Catholics can legitimately agree about, but it's better, or disagree about, but it's better if they don't drag it into arguments about the fundamental problem. You've mentioned two fundamental problems, one of which is deep corruption at the heart of the Vatican, and another of which is church attendance falling off a cliff.
Yeah, well, I tried to work it around to why we should reform and what we're trying to support, which I take to be the gospel, which offers something important. This is a scandal. It's turning people away from the gospel, young people especially. And therefore, this conversation we're having is referring to a type of disease that has stricken the leadership of our church, which, to respond to the decline in faith, seems to want to become more trendy. And instead, we don't have anybody speaking with real clarity of telling the truth, honoring whistleblowers, getting rid of corruption, reforming each aspect of the church's government and the religious orders, but also parish life, etc., and renew the church. So then I was going to just go back to the question of the leadership and say, Pope Paul VI, the Pope after the Second Vatican Council, wrote an encyclical on Humanae Vitae and then never wrote another one. He was opposed for that encyclical. Mm-hmm. But he also was very much open to the idea of human progress and the progress of peoples. And so he was entering into this modern thinking in the 70s when the church lost tens of thousands of priests and nuns. John Paul II then came in after the very short pontificate of John Paul I, the Pope, he would sometimes be told that there are accusations against this or that priest or bishop. And he would say, I know in Poland, the communists always accused the best people. Therefore, I'm not going to believe these accusations.
Yeah, you're right.
This was part of the reason that the Legionaries of Christ were so strongly supported. And finally, there was revealed to be great corruption at the top. So John Paul II was unable to have around him the right people to help him. And therefore, he was then canonized as a saint. And we had Joseph Ratzinger, whom I knew personally. And I spoke with just as I'm speaking with you. And he tried to do something you said you appreciated very much, the hermeneutic of continuity. Because what we seem to have is a church that is eliminating almost 2,000 years of its history, saying it was filled with small-mindedness, corruption, primitiveness. Now we're modern. It's the Vatican II church. We're very open to the world, and we're much better. Ratzinger, Pope Benedict said, no, we are part of a continuing tradition, and we embrace everything from the apostolic times to the present. But there is a strong group, and I think it's a heretical group or a schismatic group or something. It's a group that's wrong, that lops off everything before the 1960s. And is the group now seemingly, Joseph Ratzinger presented this hermeneutic, and then he resigned the papacy in a devastating moment also for me, because I thought he could go on. And he lived to 2022. So his physical health was not so severe, but people tell me that he would have died if he had remained Pope because the pressures on him were so great. But in any case, he couldn't find the right group around him to help and support him. He had documents stolen from his own desk. And then the election of Francis, the question of this San Gallen mafia, and they think they finally come forward to make this change, bring the church 200 years forward, in the words of Cardinal Martini. And we have this pontificate, which should have been and was presented by the circle around Francis as the reforming pontificate, to make the church very reformed and clear and transparent. And yet you're one of the greatest attackers in saying this has been a complete failure. So that's what I wanted to investigate in this perspective of all of these men.
Well, okay. Paul VI, I remember Paul VI. But by the time I remembered him, he was somebody who was, basically what I remember is, I think, a despair at some of the forces he'd unleashed. I'm not sure he was crazy about it, but I know he wasn't crazy about some of the liturgy. He was a saintly man, and he wrote some very, very beautiful things. And let's remember that he would never have called that Second Vatican Council. He didn't call it. I'm not sure he wanted it, but had he been elected Pope in 1958, there would have been no Second Vatican Council. That was John Paul the 23rd. So he basically had to deal with it. And it is important to remember, as I'm sure you do remember, that some of the radical ideas that were floating around Catholicism at the time were at least as fringe and Protestant, if you like, as the ideas that have been floated now. I mean, I remember as a teenager, the women priests were seen as a real possibility by so many Catholics. I don't think it is now. I don't think almost anybody thinks it's a possibility now. But there was a spirit abroad in the 1960s in which everything seemed to be up for grabs, and Paul VI had to grapple with that. And in some respects, he grappled with it successfully. In others, he didn't. It was a troubled papacy, but I think he was an honest and a saintly man. John Paul II was a hero of the 20th century who actually changed history. A man of towering strength who, as you very correctly say, was basically bamboozled into promoting some very sleazy characters. I mean, who made McCarrick a cardinal? Who made Bergoglio a cardinal? And with Benedict, it's like the greatest missed opportunity you could possibly imagine, because you have the finest intellect of any pope for at least 200 years.
Yeah.
One of the greatest theologians of the 20th century, somebody whose thinking in a book like The Spirit of the Liturgy, for example, is so clear, more than clear. It's inspiring. There's a sort of, he was an expert on eschatology, which is a subject that I was very, because my PhD was actually about eschatology and conspiracy theories and how they were managed in the Pentecostal community. But anyway, he was someone who wrote a huge book on eschatology. He was and aesthetically extremely cultivated, and his vision of taking the best of the Second Vatican Council and reuniting it with the mainstream of Catholic heritage was beautifully articulated in the hermeneutic of continuity, which wasn't perfect, but his initiative in restoring the old liturgy, making it available again, although it was by definition a rather complicated document, and there were always going to be trouble along the way, and it was going to be fiercely resisted, but it did seem to have bedded down. And then incomprehensibly, really, he gave up. And you have to see it in the context of his failure to deal with corruption in his own backyard. I mean, hung on to Cardinal Bertone as his Secretary of State.
Yeah.
Why? The man is still alive, isn't it? The man is corrupt. He is massively corrupt. Everybody knows he is corrupt, and you have him as Secretary of State, and Benedict, for some reason, wouldn't get rid of him.
That's right.
So many of these problems, so many of these sleazy characters who are, circling around Francis, were creatures of Bertone, or before him, Sodano, or to imagine that the culture of corruption is something that Francis created is unfortunately completely wrong. It flourished under both John Paul II and, of course, every pope. It's flourished. I've said recently it's something that's been going on for centuries. The difference, from my point of view, is that I think Francis is part of the corruption in a way that no pope in living memory has been. I believe him to be a corrupt man, and I've said so before, and he can sue me if he wants to, but I think he's corrupt, and that's why one of the reasons I don't call him the Holy Father. On the other hand, is he pope? Yes. Did he get elected through arm twisting and lobbying? Yeah. Yes, he did. Like so many popes before him. If you're going to rule out every pope who's got elected by some sort of mafia, then you're going to find enormous great holes in the in the history of the church. But what bothers me is that the man himself, in addition to a sort of chaotic, nihilistic approach to the church's teaching, magisterium, is himself deeply, deeply, deeply implicated to an extent that the vast majority of Catholic journalists and no secular journalists, virtually no secular journalists, are prepared to face up to.
Yeah, well, we've got before us several enormous problems. We cannot resolve them all in the brief time we have. I'd like to talk with you also on another occasion. I must mention that in our world there can be false accusations.
Sure. Oh my goodness! And I've known priests who've been subject to false accusations, and I know how devastating it is.
I think I know a priest in prison, and I doubt that he's guilty. He says he is innocent, and he's been in prison for a long time.
Cardinal Pell. Cardinal Pell was completely innocent. He was a friend of mine, and somebody I miss very much indeed. Somebody I admire, a hero of the church, I think, Cardinal Pell. Those were completely trumped up charges. He did no such thing. The claim that he did what he's supposed to have done was absolutely fatuous. It was a result of a fishing expedition by the Victoria Police. I also suspect that his enemies in the Vatican had a hand in it. It's inconceivable that he could have done it, and he got convicted by a kangaroo court. Finally exonerated, but the toll it took on him, and we lost him within days virtually of losing Pope Benedict, and to me it was a bigger blow.
Yeah,
to retire.
Yeah. And I bring that up just to say I like to tread a little bit cautiously on the question of corruption and abuse, because it's so easy that a false accusation will be made. And even if it's never proved, it remains like mud on the character. It's a terrific it's a terrific weapon. And it's also the case in public affairs outside of the church, in government affairs. You see this man or that is.
Well, it's like Vigano's claim about Francis. Where's the evidence? I don't think Francis did it.
Yeah,
otherwise, but I don't think he did it. But he's thrown it out there without providing anything in the way of evidence.
Yeah, our viewers may not know that this is just a little over a week ago, in a Twitter, or they call it X now. Vigano wrote that a seminary. He's talked with various seminarians over the years who've come to him and complained.
Wow. He mentioned one.
No. He mentioned one. I'm saying one of them had said to him that there had been an abuse perpetrated by Francis himself. This was picked up in various places. It's gone around the internet now, so I am not responsible for spreading it. But what you're saying is it is an accusation that there's no proof of. It's hearsay, and you think this is a terrible thing that Vigano has done.
Yeah, I do think it's an absolutely terrible thing that Vigano has done. I mean, for a start, look, Francis has so many enemies in Argentina that he hasn't dared set foot there. Do you think that if he was up to that sort of thing, it wouldn't have come out by now?
Well, these are terrible conversations now.
He's done enough bad stuff.
Yeah,
really bad stuff, covering up for people who did do that sort of thing. But I'm not saying that in a different jurisdiction and in a different world, he wouldn't be answering questions from the police, because he would be. In this country, he would be face police. The police would be visiting him and asking him questions. Unfortunately, he's head of his own tyrannical little, the most corrupt state in Western Europe, the Vatican. So there's nothing you could do about it.
I think one of the most remarkable things that you've said is this institution that we are part of called the Fourth Estate, with journalists.
Yeah.
These are people who are vowed, as it were, professionally to try to get at the truth, and without fear or favor, as we say.
Yeah.
But it's completely corrupted as a profession now. Who trusts journalists any longer? They seem to be in the employee of one lord or another lord for one issue or another, a pharmaceutical company or a government. Now, when you said...
By the way, we've got some very interesting comments cropping up that are relevant to what we're saying right now. Okay, Antonia is saying she personally thinks that Pell was murdered at the Vatican clinic because he was in good health. He certainly was not in good health. He was in very poor health. I'd seen him, so I know, and I know people close to him. I don't think he was murdered. It's possible that if he had the operation somewhere else at another time, it would have a different outcome, but I don't think he was murdered at all. But then we have Gloria Govella saying, why would Francis protect Rupnik? Could Francis have something to hide? Well, it's not really legally safe to speculate, but this is the question, I have to be honest. The question of why Francis would protect Rupnik is something that everybody is asking in Rome. Everybody is asking in Rome.
Yeah, this is one of the great mysteries now.
Then Jack Gordon says Rupnik, Zanchetta, Batista, Rica, McCarrick, etc. Too much coincidence to be coincidence, I think. Absolutely right, Jack. Yeah.
So how do we explain it?
Well, it's hard. I think you can explain the cover-ups if you read that excellent book, The Dictator Pope, by
Henry Sack.
Yeah. Sear, it's pronounced. I didn't realize until I met him. He's a very nice man.
Sear?
Sear, S-I-R-E.
He was also...
half Spanish.
Half Spanish, half British.
Yeah, and he was able to go out to Argentina, and this is before he knew about... I don't think he knew about the Zanchetta scandal when he went out. This was years ago he went out. But that was the book that was when the scales fell from my eyes, reading his book.
His book is The Dictator Pope.
And it explains the maneuverings, and it tells you a lot about the personality of Bergoglio. And so, to my mind, the fact that this Pope would do things that are so obviously outrageous in terms of protecting criminals, that doesn't surprise me at all. What does puzzle me is what he actually believes. In terms of what is his grasp of Catholic doctrine. My personal theory is he's not very interested in doctrinal matters. I've got this theory, he's not a particularly religious person. I don't think he likes, I have to say, I'm not naturally a very religious person. I don't necessarily enjoy going to mass, I have to be honest about that. Did go last night, but it's like kind of looking at my watch and whatever. And you see the Pope in these ceremonies, like he's looking at his watch too. And, when is this going to be over? But he's the Pope. Celebrated Mass, by the way, for 2 years or something. He wears the cope and he does a bit of concelebration in cope, which is, he can make the rules. But that's a very curious thing. But when he talks about doctrine and pastoral theology and questions of sexual morality, he's all over the place. It's as if he doesn't care very much. It's just, now I'm going to wind up the conservatives by saying something pro-gay. Now I've gone too far. Now I'm going to kick the liberals by saying something that will really outrage them. Now I'm going to reaffirm the traditional teaching of the church. Now, in the same breath, I'm going to undermine it by appointing a load of crazy liberals to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. He did once tell somebody I know that it was very important for him that he should be inscrutable. That people should not understand what he's up to, what he's doing, what he really thinks, what he really believes. And in that, Bob, he has truly succeeded. I don't understand what he believes. But I have this instinctive feeling that he doesn't like the Catholic Church very much, which is unfortunate given that he's the Pope.
Well, Damian, I must say, I just read your article last week in The Spectator. It came out on Unheard also.
No, I wrote it for Unheard.
Oh, you wrote it for Unheard?
Yeah.
And it's a long piece, and I read it.
It doesn't have room for 6,000 words, so yeah.
And this is, I can even show this paragraph. And I read this paragraph and I said, I've got to have Damian come on the show. And
it's such a good source as well. I can't tell you who it is, but it's a great source.
Okay, so what you say here, Francis, this is Pope Francis. And this is a source who you say now is a great,
really good one, really somebody really believable, really nice, really prepared to give the Pope the benefit of the doubt for years and years and years and years. I said that underneath it.
Okay, it sounds like probably one of the cardinals from England, but let's just say.
Oh, you think a cardinal from England? Well, you have only one cardinal from England, and the idea that he would chat to me about the Pope is implausible, to put it mildly.
All right, so this is a source.
Fighting each other for 30 years.
Here's a source.
Yeah.
We imagine perhaps from Britain.
No, it's not from Britain. No, it's a source in Rome. Yeah.
Someone in Rome, maybe a British person serving in Rome.
I don't just talk to British people.
Okay, so we can't pin it down, so we won't get that. But the source says, quote, Francis is one of the most complicated men I have ever met. Says a Vatican source who has been observing the Pope closely for a decade. Quote, he can be terrific fun and also incredibly vengeful. If you cross him, he'll kick you when you're at your lowest ebb. Well, that's a terrible description, but it gets the point across.
Yeah.
Then there's this second paragraph. But don't get the idea that he's a master strategist. He's a clumsy tactician who spends his time lighting and putting out fires. His number one priority, overriding everything else, is that he should be inscrutable. Inscrutable. No one can figure him out. He doesn't want anyone to know what he's planning to do. And if you find out, he'll do the opposite, even if it disrupts his plans. Incredible quotation that I felt when
Doesn't it make sense?
When I read this, I said, I've got to talk to Damian about our Pope, because what it does is put everything into a different light. It's as if he's operating not from profound principles, but from a tactical strategy of remaining inscrutable.
That's right.
So if he does something, you don't have to assume that
Yeah.
it's a deep theological principle or anything like that.
Yeah. Oh, here's a good comment from Thomas Macon. He doesn't love the Catholic Church. He loves the Jesuit Church instead. Actually, I think he and the Jesuits fell out a long time ago. But I remember asking somebody well-informed in Rome, I said, well, so why did you become a priest? And this person said, he didn't become a priest, he became a Jesuit, which is a very different... Now,
okay,
I had two cousins who were Jesuit priests.
Okay, but we can talk about the Jesuits in another program.
Yeah, but there's another comment. There's a comment from Antonia, she obviously doesn't agree with me on everything, but what a good point here. Pope Francis also sent Cardinal McCarrick to China to do the China deal. Well, certainly certainly he was involved with it, which wasn't covered by the media, done secretly, and harmed the true Catholics in China. Yes, without a doubt. It's still secret, by the way. We've never seen the text of this thing. We know that the Chinese government is basically turning the Catholic Church into it's hardly even Christian, let alone Catholic now. I mean, it seems to worship the Communist Party and the president of China. It seems to give him equal billing with Jesus. And what's different? First of all, this was not the case 20 years ago. The Catholic Church was not. The official Catholic Church was not as bad as that. And secondly, what you have now is Francis and Parolin, his Secretary of State, who kind of wants to put a bit of distance between himself and Francis because he'd like to be the next pope. Mm-hmm. But herding Catholics into this, semi-bogus, increasingly bogus state-run church, which was precisely the sort of thing that John Paul II, the Ostpolitik, only worse, fought against so hard in Eastern Europe.
Well, one question I wanted to ask you, have you ever heard of Esther Carriega?
No.
This was a woman Francis worked with. She was about 40 or 42 years old. He was 20. So they were quite distant apart in age. She had been a communist in Uruguay or Paraguay. Please forgive me if I make any small errors, but she was fleeing to Buenos Aires, working in a chemistry shop, and Bergoglio was there for a number of months as a colleague. And Bergoglio writes that he deeply respected her, and of course she was a communist activist who had been in danger of being arrested in Paraguay.
Yeah.
She was then arrested under the military government in Argentina about another 20 years later. That was in the 50s. She was arrested in the 70s. He was now a priest and the provincial of the Jesuit order, and soon after was to become a bishop. So she was arrested, brought in a helicopter by the government, and dropped into the sea from 20,000 feet, died. Her body washed up on the shore, and it wasn't identified for many years. And her daughter came to Bergoglio and said, the woman that you knew and worked with and that you were friends with was killed by the government. And so he was distraught at that fact that she had died in such a brutal fashion. I think that this event explains something deep about his personality with regard to political power, with regard to oppression, and therefore I think he acts as he does partly because he feels the world is a terribly cruel place and that he lost this particular person who he deeply cared about. That's a thought I wanted to mention.
It's interesting. I need to know more about that story, but it is interesting. Who is he to talk about cruelty? Frankly, he treats people. I mean, the cruelty with which he treats his subordinates, the humiliation, the public humiliation that he.
Yeah, give us a couple examples of that.
Oh,
Okay.
it's just Damien. England has two cardinals, one in Westminster, one in the Vatican. Well, it depends. Yeah, okay, yeah.
Oh, I
Well,
did want to ask you. I did.
it's not in English. Okay, fair enough. Of course, I know that. Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
I've known both of them since before they were bishops.
I wanted to ask you about Arthur Roach, Cardinal Roach, in the Vatican, in charge of liturgy for the Vatican, and
Yeah,
people have found him a little controversial. Here
yeah.
he is. You
He's
know
old.
him. How can you describe him to us, and how can you help us understand his thinking?
He's absolutely horrible man. He's a career bureaucrat in church terms. He was general secretary of the Bishops' Conference. He succeeded Vincent Nichols in the job. I knew he was an exceptionally pompous general secretary of the Bishops' Conference because I talked to Catholic Herald people who had to deal with him, and they said, "Oh, the new man is horrible." He really is. He's just, it's just, he speaks in jargon, he's pompous, he's unfriendly. But then he got made Bishop of Leeds. And as Bishop of Leeds, his responsibility, as far as I can work out, was to try and resist Summorum Pontificum because his sponsor, his mentor was Cardinal Cormac Murphy O'Connor, who I couldn't be seen to resist Summorum Pontificum too openly when it first came out, even though he was very, very opposed to it in Westminster, but basically got Arthur Roach to do his dirty work for him. So Arthur Roach started persecuting priests who were exercising their rights. Priests and people are exercising their rights under Summorum Pontificum in a far more relentless and I thought disreputable way than any other English bishop, and I looked upon him with absolute horror as Summorum Pontificum was. There were attempts to undermine the newly proclaimed Summorum Pontificum in Leeds, and I thought, good God, I just pray that this man would not be made Archbishop of Westminster. I was really worried that he might be. That Cormac was pushing him like crazy. In the end, it went to Vincent, and I breathed a sigh of relief, even though I wasn't crazy about Vincent Nichols, but I breathed a sigh of relief. But actually, in some ways, it would have been better if Arthur had that job now, which is a relatively inconsequential one, rather than the very big job he's got now, which is prefect of the Dicastery for Divine Worship. He's I call him Cromwellian in his in his assaults on Latin Mass Catholics.
Okay, so
Cromwellian, he uses sneaks and snitches.
Okay.
He's a control freak. I hate him.
Oh, well, don't mince words.
I haven't started. I am mincing words.
Okay, so I don't really want to talk too much about the person, although I was told when I first became a journalist, you cannot report on anything, but certainly not the Vatican, without knowing the persons. And you've helped us to understand this person. But the question becomes, the real question, who, if he was already in Leeds after 2007, leading an attack on the new opening that Benedict had made to the old liturgy,
yeah,
and then that precise man was chosen to become the head of the liturgy in Rome, doesn't it seem?
There's two stages there.
Yeah.
I agree, it's appalling. First of all, Benedict brought him to Rome.
Benedict
Arthur, immediately being Arthur, becomes an enthusiast for the Tridentine Mass for 5 minutes.
I didn't realize that.
Oh, it can be a very, very reverential people. People get a wonderful, sense of.
So he supported in the late, around 2010, 11, 12.
Yeah. There's film of him saying, "Oh yes, people find it very reverent," and all the rest of it.
Okay.
So but I mean, it was just, I thought at the time, what are they doing? What are they thinking? Making this man secretary? Now, don't forget, Cardinal Sarah was prefect of the Congregation for Divine Worship at the time.
Yes.
I thought, saddling him with Arthur, good Lord, that's completely nuts.
But does it sound like there's a conspiracy or an organized plan to bring certain people into certain posts and fulfill certain tasks?
Okay, I said I didn't like conspiracy theorists, but is she called Julia Maloney? She wrote a book which did have quite an interesting thesis.
Julia Maloney, the San Gallen Mafia.
Yeah, on the Sangana Mafia, which, I mean, I don't think it's not a conspiracy theory to say there was Sangana Mafia, because Daniel said we were part of it. We had it. He called it the Sangana Mafia. I knew Cardinal Murphy O'Connor, not the worst man in the world, actually, but just completely wrong about everything. I mean, he annoyed me a lot, but I wouldn't call him a villain in a million years. There are other people I would. I mean, a much nicer man than Francis, but most people are. But anyway, he was part of it, and then early on there would have been Martini. Again, okay, people didn't like Martini, but he had he had much better brain than Francis. And then you had Daniels, who was appallingly compromised figure, and I forget who else was in it. But a carrot was hovering around the edges.
Cardinal Casper.
And Cardinal Casper, who was a great, who was a formidable theologian, and they wanted. I think let's give them credit for this. They had their own profound conviction that the Tridentine Mass needed to go, because they thought its theology was wrong. And that seemed to be the conclusion of many of the people at the council. And that, when I was growing up, when you were growing up, come on, do you remember in the 70s and 80s? People who went to Tridentine Mass seemed completely weird and fringe. I didn't go to one until I was, 28 or something like that. There just weren't any. And the people who went to the Latin Mass in England were really bitter and angry and ancient. And it just seemed completely different now. Completely different. But the Sangana Mafia wanted... I don't know whether it was. I mean, was Bergoglio their candidate twice?
Yeah, I think
he was their candidate twice. But the second time round, of course, they had Summorum Pontificum to deal with, and they wanted somebody who would come in and squash it. And okay, Francis doesn't like being told what to do. He's not the puppet of any mafia. That I'll give him that. He doesn't take instructions from anybody. But he did squash it because he didn't like it and doesn't like it. And it was obvious from his time in Buenos Aires that he didn't like it. I don't know if you've ever seen that gruesome video of him distributing the Eucharist outside a church in Buenos Aires, where he's basically just tossing the host into the crowd and it's being passed around, and he doesn't give a stuff where it ends up or what sacrilegious fate it will meet. Because it's like, here's here, take a wafer, be my guest. And so he's not somebody who has a particularly, he's not a Fortescue and O'Connell man, put it that way. He's not a ritualist.
Yeah,
I'm sure he dislikes the Tridentine Mass.
But you just explain who Fortescue and O'Connell are.
Sorry, they wrote the book, which is amazing, the manual for how to celebrate the Tridentine Mass, which has got these. I've got it there somewhere. It's incredible. It's got these charts as to all these different occasions for when a pontifical mass from the full stool, when a bishop is visiting, when a bishop is presiding, and they actually do it. It looks like a chessboard of how you move around, and
so all the ritual details.
Oh, incredibly detailed. So I was saying anyway, he's not into any of that. He goes on about grandmother's lace. I thought it was very interesting. He sneers about grandmother's lace. I thought it was very interesting that when Cardinal Pizzaballa, the new, he's been Patriarch of Jerusalem for some time, but he's a new cardinal. When he came to take possession of his church in Rome, he celebrated a mass ad orientem, despite I think he moved the horrific
toward the east,
towards the east, and wearing Roman vestments and loads of lace and a dalmatic and everything underneath.
Okay.
Apparently, a lot of the mass was in Latin, so not everybody's paying attention to that. But I've no doubt that Francis intensely dislikes the ritualists.
Okay.
He really, really dislikes.
Even you don't like too much ritual. You have a.
I love the ritual. I've got no problem with the ritual at all, so long as it's done properly.
Okay.
I mean, one of my best friends is the provost of the London Oratory, Father Julian Large, who was the pastor to my poor sister when she was dying, and he's a master of celebrating the Old Rite, and I think the Old Rite is a wonderful mass. Actually, it's a wonderful ceremony that should be accessible to absolutely everybody and celebrated all over the place. That's my opinion.
Well, I would love to come back on these questions. And again, sorry about the loss of your sister.
Oh, well, that's
You told me earlier your father died many years ago and your mother more recently, and then you were devastated when your sister passed. So,
yeah, I was, yeah.
so you're all alone now.
Well, I'm not entirely alone, well, it can feel that way. And the thing is, it can make you very angry very easily, and I have to watch this, which is why recently, just in the last week or so, I've kind of stepped back from my Twitter account. In fact, what I've done is I've given the password of it to a very good friend of mine.
But is he posting for you?
Yeah, we hasn't posted anything yet because I just was getting into such terrible fights.
I know you say controversial things almost every other day, and I read them and I say I've got to understand more what your mind is.
It's partly, I mean, I don't know whether they're cultural things or whether it's just who I am. But then if you go back to articles I wrote in 1989 or whatever, you'll find that because I'm a secular journalist, and these days, certainly, you know, I don't have a position with the Catholic newspaper. I write for the Spectator, which is, you know, doesn't have a religious affiliation. So I don't. There are certain niceties I don't have to observe. It would be, you know, the Catholic Herald. Goodness me, it's a difficult line to tread, isn't it? Showing the necessary loyalty to Pope Francis while acknowledging the horrific abuse of his office. And I'm glad I don't actually have to tread that too much. I can actually say I think the guy's a villain because I do.
Well, so we'll just finish in a few minutes now. The Unheard article, it ends with about 9 men named as possible successors to Pope Francis. We could run through those quickly. I think our listeners would be interested in your choices. I don't know. I can help you if you don't remember who you said.
Well, all these speculations are likely to make people look foolish.
Yes, because it could be that none of them will be.
I can tell you who wants the job. Well, Cheeto, what's he called? The cardinal from the Philippines. Tagle wants it, but I don't think he'll get it. Something went wrong at Caritas. He fell out of favor so dramatically with Francis, and I think he's just too. I don't think he really want the job. Too obviously, I don't. And the other thing is, this is probably too complicated subject to get into right now, but I think the whole fiducia supplicans thing created a big problem for Francis in that there was clearly there is something approaching a blocking third of cardinals who will not vote for anybody who was too associated with that, or who is too, let's put it this way, anybody who's really closely associated with the Francis project. I think now we're back to a situation where you need 2/3 of the votes. They're not going to get 2/3 of the votes. So Tagle, I don't think is in the running. There's people are talking about Pete Sabala, who's
Pete Sabala from Jerusalem.
He's Italian, but he hasn't lived there. He doesn't really identify as Italian anymore. He's very clever. He's very quick on his feet.
He's Franciscan.
Like he's Franciscan, but doesn't make a huge deal out of being a Franciscan.
So Pietro Pizzaballa, Antonio Tagle from the Philippines.
Then we have, I mean, the candidate I worry about is Parolin.
Pietro Parolin, Secretary of State.
Which I find, you know, I've had people in the Vatican who really should know better, in my opinion, who know him, who he's charmed, saying, "Oh, I think he'd be, you know, he's not perfect, but I think he'd be such an improvement on."
Yes, I know him as well, and he's quite charming.
He's quite charming, but he's also an operator.
But you say you're particularly the China agreement.
It's not just the Chinese deal; it's the way he's a politician.
Yeah.
And you know, you can see himself positioning himself all over the place. But basically, if anybody is the architect of that disgusting Chinese deal, it's Parolin. And the idea that he's, you know, for even a second, you should consider him as a candidate for me is just horrific. Besides which, all that this corruption, basically, you know, you can blame it on whoever you like, but basically, he was running the Secretariat of State when, you know, all these property deals were done, all these billions were being laundered. So, I don't think it should be him. Are
Okay.
there possibilities? There's the candidate of the Conservatives, perhaps not. He's certainly not very conservative. He's certainly not a big supporter of the Latin Mass, but is Cardinal Erdo,
Peter Erdo of Budapest,
Hungary, who I've met, who's impressive, and I certainly think I could certainly envisage him as Pope. He may be an unassuming scholar, but I really can see him. I can see him as Pope. The question is, if he becomes identified as the cardinal, the candidate of the Conservatives, then he could be again. You need 2/3 of those votes. Doesn't Parolin have cancer? Asked Karen Collins. Well, yeah, probably has had it. He does not deny it, but
you said something incredible in your article that was told to you by your source.
Well,
he wouldn't.
Such a cynicism of Vatican politics that Parolin's. It's almost too cynical to. I don't really want to go into it.
Well, go ahead.
He's certainly not. Because everybody's talking about it, I stuck it in there. Everybody is talking about Parolin's health, about him having had cancer, but he may have recovered from it. Lots of people do. We don't know.
But the cynical thing that was said was
that they might be talking it up because the cardinals might think they want a short pontificate.
So they might
maybe, rather than taking that too seriously, let me give you that just as a flavor of the cynicism.
The cynicism that cardinal or men around Parolin might tell the other cardinals, yes, he does have a cancer.
Well, I think he has had something. He's said,
which we do not know. I'm not saying that.
What's interesting, that hasn't been.
But he's saying that
because acknowledged that he's had a health episode.
Because they hope that the next pope will be just 4, 5, 6 years, not 7, not 26. So they think it's a positive that he may be sick.
Meanwhile, the question of Francis's health was every time you think that the pontificate is coming to an end, he seems to burst back to life. That's again, it's a difficult thing to talk about. You're talking about a man's life. He's not going to retire, not in a million years. Power matters to him enormously. So the prospect of him retiring is an unlikely one. But then
So just to repeat what you said earlier, there's a block now among the Africans, some of the Asians, Kazakhstan, which were so upset about fiducia supplicans, the blessing of couples, that they will not accept somebody now. They'll block someone who they feel is too close to Francis. That was the end result of the.
Certainly, they will block. Yes, I think so, and certainly they will block. I mean, nobody is very close to Francis. I mean, I think that has to be very clear. Francis is not somebody who allows people to get close to him. People talk about Francis as an inner circle. There is no such thing, really. I mean, there are people with whom he works closely, but that's different from having, an inner circle, people on whom he relies psychologically. People, I ask who they are, and people sort of shrug their shoulders, because no sooner is somebody in Francis's inner circle than he kicks them out quite sadistically. So, what the blocking third would apply to any cardinal who approved same-sex blessings. But now we're in a situation where Francis does seem to have rode back on fiducia supplicans to a very significant extent, to the point where you think, well, how does Rodriguez feel about this? Fernandez, sorry. How does Fernandez?
Victor Fernandez, the head of the Doctrine of the Faith.
How does he feel about that? Because has he been thrown under the bus? Why did the Pope sign it? I think the answer is because the Pope hadn't thought about it. I don't think he takes it.
Okay, we mentioned 4 cardinals: Tagle, Parolin, Erdo, and
but it'll be none of the above, as usual. I mean, who would have predicted Wojtyła? They weren't even predicting Luciani in 1978. They really weren't. He was on a long list, but that was why he was in such terrible despair when he was elected. He really didn't want the job. He was in terrible despair because he really didn't think it was going to happen. Wojtyła was up to the challenge, but he wasn't on the short lists of anybody commenting. I think he was on the short list of some cardinals, but we don't know. Then, as now, we don't know.
Well, one of the most interesting things you said toward the beginning of our conversation is there's a court circle of journalists who present Francis in the best possible light.
Yeah.
And then there's a few conservative journalists who attack him, but you don't feel there's any group, substantial group, that just has the interest of the church and truth. Both of these two main groups, the circle, the magic circle of court journalists, and the attacking dogs, you might call them, we're missing a group that would be a little bit above the fray and a little more longer looking.
I think it's complicated. There's a spectrum, all right? You get genuine liberals like Robert Mickens, who's leaving Rome anyway, as there are a number of them, who's very, very left-wing and very, who lines up with Francis on all the controversial issues, but is prepared to be, who is genuinely, I think, horrified when he sees these crimes being covered up, and actually gave the real low-life hacks on the Vatican plane who won't ask any difficult questions. He gave them a hard time. There are very conservative and honest journalists, people like Edward Pentin and Diana Montagna. Their views are more conservative than mine, but these are honest people who report stories responsibly. Then there's another crowd who are less scrupulous about dealing with conspiracy theorists. And then you have this hardcore and very well-connected hardcore who have links to the big American news networks of people who, know probably what Francis has done and aren't going to report it under any circumstances. Unless there's a new pope and it becomes in their interest to do so. And that's very big, and I call them out about it. But I got fed up with calling them out about it because they don't care. They don't care. They know that their news organizations are never going to report the stuff that they don't want to get out, so they just don't care. I can scream myself blue in the face about the Rupnik scandal. What I do think is interesting is this outfit, The Pillar, which is only 5 years old.
Yes. Yeah.
They are the most objective in terms of the detailed news coverage. That is the place to go. I have my own problems with them because I think that their editor-in-chief disgraced himself over first of all, he pointed out various loopholes that were being used by Latin Mass Catholics, and then, okay, fair enough, he's a canon lawyer, but then when Roach closed them, he kind of patted himself on the back, at which point I personally ended my subscription to The Pillar because I was so angry at the thought that he was contributing to the suppression of the Latin Mass in various places. That made me so angry. But on the other hand, Ed Conan's a really good journalist. Luke Coppen, one of my best friends in the world, who used to be the editor of the Catholic Herald in the days when it was worth reading, and I was.
But so you're kind of a contradiction. You say it's a very good source, but you say you canceled your subscription.
Yeah, well, I didn't. I felt personally horrified and betrayed. I mean, I just felt so angry that these people who, on the whole, provide excellent coverage of church matters had, on this particular subject, about which I feel very strongly, well, their editor-in-chief, this is an argument with I have with their editor-in-chief, had crowed about the role he played in the suppression of the Latin Mass. And I'm not giving money to that. And I've explained it to, my friends at The Pillar. I'm sorry. I'm so furious about it.
Well, we have to conclude this conversation. I would like to speak with you again. Do you think we could do that?
Sure. I'm sorry if I come across as carping and...
No. People like...
We live in very... I don't like the conspiracy theories. I never have done. Sorry. If that's your big thing, if Ukraine, COVID is your big thing, I'm not your man, okay? But if you're interested in uncovering the truth about the deep corruption in the Vatican, and I think the appalling personality of the man who got himself legitimately but tragically elected Pope, and if you wish to see something very different, and if you want to see the traditional Latin Mass once again fully available to Catholics, then I fully support you.
So, Damien, the last thing I would like you to maybe tell us some spiritual thing, a consoling reflection on a passage of scripture or some event in your life, something that would be positive, so we can close the conversation.
I think I would say I would look to not myself, because I don't think I've got any spiritual wisdom to offer, but I would think about my mother and my sister and my father and my grandparents, and I would think about their love of the faith and how it sustained them through incredibly difficult times, and how, in a sense, all these controversies were really secondary to their love of the church and their love of Christ, which was overpowering and the thing that motivated them in their lives. And nothing can take that away. Nothing that happens after their death can take that away. And I'm sure that your viewers, either themselves or people, and probably I'm sure themselves and people in their families whose faith is so strong and whose acts of charity are so inspiring. My parents ran a pilgrimage to Lourdes for incurably and very severely handicapped people until my father died. He ran it for 25 years for group captain Leonard Cheshire. Nothing can take away from their self-sacrificing witness to the gospel. Nothing can take that away, not even this man.
Thank you, Damien. That was beautiful. Until next time. Thank you, Damien.
Thanks, Bob.